Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Peter Mendelson in support of the delivery this evening and in conversation with author Jane Mendelsohn. First, a quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event as I will be sending links to purchase the delivery and more books from Literati Bookstore. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there is always a link to purchase books right in the description below me. And if you're watching live, you can, of course, submit questions using the Q&A portion of the webinar available to you at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we also ask if you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Peter Mendelson is a novelist, graphic designer, and the creative director of The Atlantic. He's the author of several books about literature and the visual imagination, what we see when we read, cover, and the look of a book, jackets, covers, and the art at the edges of literature. His debut novel, Same Same, was published in 2019. Jane Mendelsohn is the author of 4 novels, I Was Amelia Earhart, a New York Times bestseller, and a finalist for the Orange Prize, Innocence, American Music, and Burning Down the House. A graduate of Yale, she lives in New York City with her husband and children. They can't see you or hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Peter Mendelson and Jane Mendelsohn into your living rooms.
Thank you. So, hi, Jane.
Hi, Peter.
How's it going?
It's going okay.
This is exceedingly strange, especially because we did all of our preliminaries about 15 minutes ago before anybody could listen to this. And now we have to pretend to be seeing each other for the first time. How are you this lovely evening?
Well, I'm great, and I'm so happy to see you because it's been way too long, and I miss you.
Yes.
I love your book.
Ditto.
And I'm happy to be talking about it.
And how often do we have this quorum of Mendelsons on a Zoom call? I know, it's like the plenary session of Mendelsons, although we need Daniel and maybe Charlotte also.
Oh, Charlotte, we do need.
And Edward Mendelson, wait, there's another one.
Yes.
That would actually be a really interesting event, come to think of it, and maybe someday we should pull that together.
The same town in Vilnius.
The Sons of Mendel. So I thought maybe we would start with a little short reading, if that's okay with you, Jane.
Yeah, it is.
And I'll set up this reading very briefly, and when I'm done, then we can sort of launch into it. So for those of you who haven't read this book, it is a book. It is really a parable about language acquisition and sort of the limits of the empathetic imagination. But the plot is about a delivery boy who, in an unnamed city, who hails from an unnamed country, he's a refugee, who works on his bike, basically delivering goods to people better off than himself. And maybe I'll add parenthetically at this moment that the sort of the profession we think of as like TaskRabbit didn't quite exist as such in the moment at which this novel is written. So even though I think in most people's minds they'll go, I mean, especially in the pandemic, this is a profession that's come very much to the fore, especially if you live in an urban place the way I do in Manhattan. You see guys on bikes delivering things. Every time I walk out of my house, I see them. So I always think that that's important to mention, that when this book was written, this was not what I had in mind. And maybe we can talk about this a little later, Jane, but nevertheless, if it helps to imagine one of these people, these TaskRabbits, Um, this guy is a delivery guy, and the beginning of the book just sort of, we see him going place to place and delivering his goods and sort of suffering under the thumb of a sort of nefarious supervisor. He has a crush on a woman who's a dispatcher in the warehouse where he works and lives, who hails from the same unnamed country as he does. And at the point of the book that I'm about to read, he's just gotten into some bad trouble because he has skimmed a little bit of money from this supervisor and used it to buy a present for this woman and gotten caught. So as a kind of punishment, he has to deliver a group of packages for this supervisor outside of the city to a place he's never been to. And the whole thing has a very sinister feel about it. He doesn't know what's in these bags. And in this new homeland of his, he's never left this very circumscribed area of the city. So this is him setting out. He wove among the cars, finding lanes that shouldn't have existed. Spaces were folded and unfolded by the flow of traffic. He knew every move of each vehicle on the street, and anticipating, made the most of it, cutting up the roadway in unexpected shapes, his bike a blade, and he found himself laughing at drivers, taunting other delivery boys. He leaned far to one side and then corrected to the other, never having to stop at lights, crosswalks, never having to dismounting at intersections. He thought of this as a failure in a kind of child's game. And soon the way opened up. Looking ahead as he coasted, he began to feel the neighborhood around him transform. But into what? All the streets and roundabouts he had become intimate with over those days and months, for who knows how long. These streets that he had once believed would always be part of a disorienting and alien future, this old route was perhaps now becoming precisely that. Old, scenery, part of the long unfurling of his past. Now he was moving towards something, and that something was getting it right. This, he concluded, was being a man about things, which meant insisting, and then accepting, no embracing the penalties for such insistence, declaring one's feelings and being rebuked if necessary. Yes, there were new debts to be paid, and yes, the path was not without peril, but the delivery boy now noticed a fresh excitement surge out from some subterranean spring, an excitement at traveling outside the tightly belted limits of his old circumscribed life. He was full up, ready, as if the world were suddenly and unaccountably available, affordable, proffered. In that moment, he felt nothing but this strange upwelling sense of agency. He released his grip, tucked his legs up, closed his eyelids slightly against the wind, and felt it play on his teeth and on the back of his throat. He opened and closed his mouth, and as he did so, the wind produced the snap of a bitten apple, red, yellow, green. The delivery boy saw the borderlands of his old neighborhood as a new series of discrete pictures, as if he were already transcribing the saga of his own great journey. A tall striped stack made of stamped tin jutting out of the middle of the avenue, gouting smoke. He and the rest of the traffic divided around it and slackened, as if the street and all of its noise, motion, and commerce, and even the delivery boy himself, were powered by currents of underground steam, which now leaking lost vital energy and slowed the entire apparatus. An old man, angled forward, bent almost in half as he walked, his hands clasped behind his back. A young man leaning up against a lamppost smoking. He had a dog on a leash. A young woman approached, bent down, and spoke to the dog. The young man took the last drag of his cigarette and flicked it away. The late afternoon sun perched directly on a chimney like an egg in an egg cup. A man flipping and dropping a coin while another man watched. A doorman spraying down the sidewalk with a hose. 3 women gathered over a phone and smiling as if they were bending over a cradle. A man driving past him in a car that was shiny and yellow, and though the delivery boy thought the yellow was wicked, he wondered what it must be like to drive that car on days when the driver felt sad. A visibly crazy woman gibbering into a roadside help box, a man carrying a mirror across the street, which is to say an unexpected, if brief and blurred, portrait of a ragged, determined delivery boy. I won't tell you what happens next. So,
I think it's a beautiful book, and I love that passage.
thank you, Jane. You know, I will say it's hard to choose a passage from this book because formally the book changes so much from the beginning to the end. I don't know if that's something that we necessarily want to get into.
I think we do.
Okay, good.
We can start with that. I mean,
Great.
It does. I want to say that the book, I'll just say the book changes formally very much because, as you said, it's a lot about language acquisition. And in the beginning, the delivery man doesn't speak the local language, and the book, which is so beautiful and beautiful on the page.
They did a great job at FSG. I'm very happy with it.
And it's also, you did a great job because you are so graphically genius, but also it's a graphic also reflection of how the delivery boy gradually accumulates language and then eventual fluency.
Yes.
And there are these epigraphs that I want to talk about and just dive right in because I think that's super interesting. There's
Great.
E from Wittgenstein, however you want to pronounce that. E from Philosophical Investigations.
Yep.
And while I think that they're all about language acquisition superficially, I was very interested in your opening description of the book because the part of the book that interests me even more than the language acquisition, the empathetic imagination, because I think that those epigraphs, and maybe you'll read them aloud because they're very important to understanding the book.
Sure.
This is a book about somebody who goes from knowing nothing about where he is to becoming, spoiler alert, fluent and conversant. But I also think it's a book about how much can we get inside somebody else's head. And as much as Philosophical Investigations, so I'm diving right in here.
That's great. I'm so happy about where you're headed. So
as much as it is about language acquisition, I think it's equally about other minds, right? It's
yes.
That's really that's, to me, that's the interesting part of Philosophical Investigations.
Yes.
And that's the more, just for me,
yes,
the more interesting part of the book is the anxiety and the problem and the challenge and really the fictional project.
Yes. I mean, I would just, first of all, that's wonderful. And I'm so glad that you picked up on that. I mean, the first thing I would posit is that I think, first of all, let me just explain. The epigraphs at the beginning of each of the three sections of the book are quotes from the novelist, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's second big book, which was unpublished in his lifetime, called the Philosophical Investigations. And it is a book that seeks to essentially undo the work of his first book, the Tractatus, which was a book about how he thought at the beginning language functions as a map of reality, which is a theory he later repudiated. Then he wrote the Philosophical Investigations, which really is a series of very kind of loosely structured interrogations of how language is used, language in use. He's very interested in not meaning as mapping, but as meaning as use, and is something like a game, and he keeps coming back to this idea of a game, something that people engage with a series of rules together. And I think what I would say is that for him, the idea of language acquisition and being able to play this language game where you put out a sentence, someone else responds with a sentence. We have this limited set of means, but an infinite, like a chess set, an infinite set of moves that we can make. That it really is about understanding the other. Like that is I would say for Wittgenstein, that is a really huge thing. And for me, I would say the central problem of this book, which is, as you said, maybe the problem of fiction in general, is how do you even have the gumption to begin to colonize someone else's life? How do you, by taking them, fictionalizing them, putting words in their mouth, puppetizing them, what gives one the right?
Yes.
And
I saw that as the central question of this book, and why those were the guideposts, those were the epigraphs. Although
yes,
there is this plot, and I would call it a plot, and I would say that it is a book with quite a bit of plot, even though maybe others would
that's
not.
good. I'm glad to hear that. It's sort of the parable problem, right? It's like the parable problem is too much plot and it fails as a parable, not enough plot, it fails as a reading experience. It's really.
Yeah, well, it's also though the question of what do you mean by plot? Like plot,
Right.
this is plot in a minutiae kind of way. Like a lot happens, but a lot of it's very small, or a lot happens and it's in his head. But it isn't a book where somebody just sits on a bench the whole time. Like a lot of things happen.
Yes, things do happen.
Things do happen, and he changes, and a lot happens. And then I would even say that it's actually almost, I mean, you wouldn't read this and say, or you wouldn't describe this to somebody and say, this is an epic saga. No. On the other hand, the other thing I want to talk about, Other Minds, is that there's this narrator who gradually comes in. And I think that character is also dealing with this issue of other minds. And how do
very
we
much.
have, as a fiction writer, how does one have, as you say, the gumption, the chutzpah, Purim, happy Purim, everybody. How do we have the, or presumptuousness to investigate other minds and imagine? This has become such a fraught question. And I
the most fraught.
Most fraught. It's a hugely fraught question right now. What's the point? Can you do it? Should you only write about yourself? I felt it as a tension and an anxiety in this book.
Yes, you felt correctly.
In a rich way,
Well, the idea was like, how do you make something productive out of that anxiety? And in this moment, I think where we are so, in many cases, scared, trepidatious about that colonizing activity, that idea of speaking for someone else and what right do you have to speak for somebody else. These are all very important questions, obviously. The question was raised in my mind, well, but every interaction we have with the world is a colonizing interaction. It comes at us as information, and then our imaginations make of it. They foreground some things and they background others, and our imagination constructs, mostly out of the cloth of our own experience, if we're empathetic, a point of connection. Yes. And to foreclose on empathy in that way, and the empathetic imagination, seems really sad to me. So as I embarked on writing about this poor guy and was hectored by this feeling of who the fuck am I to be doing this, it occurred to me that it is really kind of the fiction problem, but it's also just the problem of human minds together in trying to make sense of one another, and the hope that as much as we police those boundaries, we don't somehow keep one another from trying to stretch outside the limits of our own boundaries to maybe presumptuously imagine what it's like to be someone else. And I think that's, in a way, it's a civic responsibility. I mean, and of course, one has to be cautious about it. So you're right, it was an anxiety. I'd say every book I've ever written comes out of an anxiety, or maybe everything I ever do.
Very productive result of that. And I think that it's an incredibly important question, pressing today, but I think actually an issue always. I think it's the problem of other minds is the problem of empathy and compassion.
Do you find that in your novel writing that there is that anxiety of sort of not even just the vampiric thing, because I think, anybody who writes anything, fiction, nonfiction, there is a kind of vampiric element to it. But do you have fears of getting it wrong, and the moral responsibility when you're writing about somebody who represents, say, the way a lot of characters do? Hopefully they're rich and round, but then hopefully also they serve as a metaphoric marker of some kind. Do you have that fear that you're going to get it wrong?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to sound, I'm so scared to answer this question. It's like a terrifying question to answer, but
I'm so sorry.
But I'll be totally honest and say no.
Mhm.
Where I come from in my literary thinking,
Mm.
I never forget for a second that a book is made up, and the
Mm.
book is it's make believe. It comes from
Mhm.
the writer's mind and sensibility, whether that's an empathetic or a compassionate one. I'm interested in the sensibility of the author, and I never
Mm.
forget about that. I don't lose myself in books. I
Mm.
love books. I
Mm.
revel in books, but I read them in a double way. So I'm reading the plot, the characters, but the idea of am I going to get it wrong? I
Mm.
don't. I don't ever think that it is, and this is maybe going to be misunderstood, but I'm seem to always be misunderstood, so it's okay.
Join the club, my friend.
Um, I feel like, of course, it's coming from me. How else
Mm.
could it? I'm not
Yeah.
pretending to be anyone else. I'm trying to empathize. I'm going as far as I can with empathy and compassion and imagination.
Mhm.
But this book is written by one author, one sensibility, and a zeitgeist, and a general,
Sure.
global connectedness. But I don't really worry about getting it wrong because I don't really think there's a right.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. Like, if you do see the act of writing fiction as walled off in that way, that it is its own kind of magical theater that has its own rules and its own calculus, and maybe it refers tangentially to the quote unquote real world, that lessens that responsibility, and it becomes more of a sandbox, which is, like, I can imagine would be a hugely enjoyable experience. The thing that I always think is that I am constantly alert to the ways that fiction uh, starts to creep into actually what we would call real life. And in fact, much of real life is in fact a series of fictions that are kind of layered on one another. Even the idea of, like, you have this delivery boy, he's a subaltern. What makes somebody where they are on a particular hierarchy is a degree of a bunch of factors that involve economics, and they involve social factors, but a lot of those factors are just sort of historical fictions of various kinds. And I'm very interested in, to me, and maybe this is just because I came up um, as a reader in the 80s, when it was sort of the height of the metafictional moment, the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s.
Yes.
Like, for me, I just sort of feel like fiction, nonfiction, it's all like, it's just sort of, I'm not sure where those hard boundaries lie. And of course, this is a particularly fraught moment to be talking about that, because we just suffered 4 years under administration that also didn't know where those boundaries lay. So there are dangers there.
I think there are boundaries. I think nonfiction, definitely, if it's calling itself nonfiction, has a real responsibility to maybe get it right, as you put it, or certainly not be fake, or what we've come to call fake. But
Right.
I think fiction is fake and is always fake, and
Mm.
um, in the best way of not being literal. And I
Mm.
think, as bad as the fake news of the last 4 years was, so was the literalism and the
Mm-hmm.
lack of nuance and the
Mm.
lack of metaphor, and taking things too literally, to me, is a kind of, that's the path toward injustice, that's the path toward tyranny. And so I think
Yeah.
fiction is important, not just for compassion between people, but
Mm.
because I think to be able to think metaphorically is also thinking outside of yourself, of the literal,
Mm-hmm.
and is we, otherwise everything has no nuance, has no subtlety. Everything is a
Yeah.
sledgehammer.
I
And
love that. And actually, if you think about metaphor structurally, this is like that. I mean, it is a bridge. That is exactly what it is. It's finding commonality between two things that may intersect, like a Venn diagram. It's finding whatever piece there is that can be shared between two fundamentally unlike things. And I think you're right. Like, metaphor is an extremely valuable tool, and it is structurally mirrors compassion in some ways.
I think it's the essence of, to me, the reason metaphor is important is because it is the essence of compassion. You can't believe in other minds. Other minds are a metaphor to you. Other minds, you can't have that if you can't imagine. And so how can you have compassion without the metaphor of, or the metaphorical thinking of somebody being like me or as, or, I don't think we can think of other people without that kind of.
Yeah.
So I think
And that is,
metaphor is leads to a loss of empathy, a lack of empathy. And
yes.
that brings me to, when you say this book is a bridge, I think that there is this narrator character. And
right.
that the book is also, if you mean that, it's bridging these two. The narrator character kind of brings up this whole anxiety about, can we get into other minds? Because now we have somebody else narrating the story, right? Not
yeah.
you.
I mean, there's a series of narrators in the book, really. I mean, without it becoming too much of a mise en abîme, like the delivery boy himself, when confronted with lower on the ladder than he is, reflexively tries to construct a story. There's a character named Waj who lives in the ground and literally just lies on the ground all day long.
Right.
And the delivery boy finds himself sort of, like I said, reflexively trying to imagine a backstory for him. The delivery boy himself is being imagined by this narrator, who of course is being imagined by me. And without being like too clever boots about it, which is just annoying and sort of my MO. The idea is that this is what the world is like, a series of narrations that sometimes collide and sometimes overlap, and some of us get it wrong sometimes and some of us get it right. But the structures of, to use that word again, the narrator's past as himself an emigre from a troubled sort of crypto Eastern European, based on stories from my grandfather, essentially, who was himself a refugee.
Was he maybe, is the book maybe dedicated?
Yes, it is dedicated to my grandparents.
That's what I thought. And
yeah.
I read the narrator to be of that era, sort of pictured as sort of Nabokov-like character.
That's right, exactly right. And yeah, and that's why the language, that the narrator's language specifically, is so Nabokovian, which is useful too, because I think of Nabokov as sort of the English language writer ne plus ultra of sort of like Logoria, and like the most words possible and the most sort of interesting words possible. And so he really contrasts with the delivery boy's sort of laconic and short and succinct and unvarnished kind of delivery.
But how beautifully they connect, in that we're talking about two characters, emigres, refugees, who didn't speak the language, wrote in a foreign language, and who left countries, presumably because there was, well, we know with Nabokov or your grandparents, we know bad stuff, and presumably the same, although we never know exactly with the delivery boy, although we get enough information about that orchestra and everything that goes on.
You can tell it's bad.
It's bad. It's bad. And all countries where things were bad, and they were so brave to come, and they had no language. And here's a point of connection between this delivery boy who has no language, and then the idea of the highly, whatever we're going to call Nabokov, but certainly nothing if not fluent.
Yes.
A genius of fluency, a genius of language, and they connect. And I think that's so beautiful in the book.
Well, that's really, yeah. I mean, I'm so glad to hear you say that. And that is really that's the sort of foundational idea here, is that these stories, although they're not the same, and that's important,
But you don't say they are. You
Yeah.
don't say they are. You're just making not even a comparison. You're making a relationship between
Yes.
the stories that I think is completely valid, very beautiful, very timely, and very much the essence of fiction and also life.
Yes. Well, I mean, the funny thing about it is, like, a lot of these stories, if not the stories themselves in their sort of their like the facts and sort of diegetic sort of stuff of the stories, the tenor of the stories do come from my grandfather, who left Poland in 1939, literally in the moment of the Anschluss, like literally left between the Nazi tanks. That's
what I assumed.
Yeah.
The dedication, and when I was reading about the narrator, even though I didn't think the narrator was your grandfather, I felt a mixture.
Yes, I mean, Nabokov.
He didn't. He
is.
Wasn't, it wasn't the same kind of circumstance, and
and Nabokov had, like, I mean, I think in both cases there were sort of salad days, right?
Yes.
I try to sort of imagine what my grandfather and grandmother's sort of days as Bundists and radicals were like. And I think that there was a moment, in fact, in Eastern Europe, at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, before the rise of the Third Reich, where there was almost a kind of utopian moment for Jews. And they were the intelligentsia, they were allowed to travel, they were allowed to hold various kinds of offices, they were respected in various ways. They obviously, so there is this moment, which I think is maybe akin to Nabokov's sort of White Russian moment in at his, I mean, it's not a dacha, it's a winter palace in strangely named Vera. Did you know that? The name of the town where his family's house was?
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, Vyra. But still, this, again, structure, sorry to bring up that word, but it's the same, right? It's like the golden utopian moment, and then the Anschluss or the Bolsheviks or what have you.
The walking down to the bridge, the life is beautiful in this European city that's cosmopolitan, that accepts different people, where there's an intelligentsia that is at its height, and then the moment before the darkness. And I think you captured that very beautifully too, and it applies to various stages. I don't know that our delivery boy totally had that, although he did have a childhood of joy. And
yes.
So that's very similar. Not that he had his moment of, like, know, being in coffee houses and arguing about communism.
No, I think
he had his moment of going to the orchestra and having the crush on the girl, and he had a happy childhood. And I think there's those moments, and then life and history. And this part, I feel like, yes, in a book you want to get it right, but you want to get it emotionally right. You want to get it, in my opinion. I mean, it may be the opposite of what most people think, that you should absolutely get it totally historically right.
No, I think you're totally right, Jane.
I write parables too. So, I mean, there's a reason my first novel was called I Was Amelia Earhart. It's not because I think I'm Amelia Earhart or was, although a lot of people came up to me and thought that I really believed I was the reincarnation of Amelia. But it was a fictional construct.
Right.
The idea that I'm this character.
It's the oldest fictional construct. Sing in me muse, right? Like the author enters the work. It is the oldest form of metafiction and framing device, and it's a really good and useful one. And and I mean, I think you're exactly right about getting it emotionally right. And for me, as somebody who has just started writing fiction over the last few years and has come into it more as a series of sort of philosophical thought experiments, I'm slowly finding that the parts of it that I really love, the parts of it that I want to keep at, are those parts that you're describing, the emotionally getting it right. And in fact, like, the new thing that I'm working on now is, I guess you'd call straight up realism, which is really new for me. And I do have these moments that you're describing, like, you want to describe something that's going to resonate with people, that they'll have that moment of recognition. And And here's a question for you, actually, because one of the problems I'm having with those moments right now in this new book that I'm working on is, so how do you get recognition in a reader for a moment, an event, a gesture, something that someone says, without relying on cliche? And what I mean by that is that the recognition tends to come from people that when people read something that they've already been told that they feel over and over again, that's the best way to get them to recognize a feeling. And for the first time in realism now, I'm finding that's a problem. Like,
Yes.
I
Otherwise,
keep saying things that feel trite.
yes. Well, I don't know exactly what the question is, but I don't think what I write is realism.
No, I don't either, honestly.
I really don't. And I don't, I mean, even when I'm writing something that kind of seems real, like my most recent book, which was not even that recent anymore, but
This is American Music, or
no.
Burning
Down the House was
Burning Down the House, right?
Was probably had the least fantastical element, but it was
Sure.
real, and it was really trying to capture a moment. And it was 2016, and I was trying to capture a moment of, you know, I think things are pretty horrible, and everybody's saying whatever. We don't have to get into it, but I was kind of trying to say maybe this is going to get really ugly, but that's not what a lot of people were saying in March of 2016. So when the book came out.
But you're right. That is, of your books, that's the one that strikes me as the most sort of the most realist in the way it's commonly understood.
Very extreme, and people certainly saw it as like preposterously extreme. Although then we saw in the following 4 years, it was hardly extreme. I was writing about a real estate mogul and the, you know, succession issues in his family. I was writing about sex trafficking. All of this became much more. I mean, not to pat myself on the back, but. I was writing about things that then became much more comfortable being talked about.
Right.
I think I was too soon, but I was also writing it in a very hyper realist way. So I don't even consider that book realist, because things happen in it that are so extreme, because I'm trying to capture the emotion, the intensity, the feeling more than I'm trying to capture reality. That
I see. Yeah. And maybe that answers my question, honestly, Jane, because I think, and even the prescience part of what you're saying, because I think that if you're of the temperament where you look at the world and you maybe wonder about counterfactuals, what if this wasn't the case? What if that was the case? What if this person was feeling X, Y, or Z? If that's sort of your temperament, then you're more apt to see things that are developing in the world than somebody who is used to being in whatever runnels they're told to be in. When you're not flexing that muscle, whether it's an empathetic muscle or a kind of like just scrying your crystal ball muscle, when you're not actually just exercising your brain in that way, then of course you would think that those kinds of things are outsized in that particular moment in 2016. But I think if you are in fact speculating in that way that novelists do, that kind of constant nagging what if, then you do end up sort of maybe hitting the zeitgeist on the head, even if a little too early, you know?
Or maybe if you spend a lot of time alone, but read a lot the way I do, you just sort of have a different sense of time and a different distance and a different perspective. And hasn't always served me in terms of hitting the target of what someone wants to hear at that moment. But I feel like that's just, for better or for worse, that's the way I write. And
I mean, but listen, the long view is
writing what I saw. But again, I think terms like realism, they don't, realist or not realist or whatever, though I don't find those terms for me that useful. Because again, it always goes back to sort of storytelling and the primal storytelling urge. And I feel like incredible stories with unbelievable relationships and human emotion and compassion, and stories that can move and change people or get them thinking or have a meeting of minds, because to me that's what a book is. It's a meeting of minds. I don't really care if it's realistic or not. That doesn't really, it's really the sensibility and the emotion and the connection
Mhm.
Vacation, and I feel like that can happen in many, many different
Mm,
forms. So I have no,
right.
I write
I
the way
love
I
that.
write, but I love lots of books that are realism, or there are books that are
Sure.
considered realist that I feel like, how can people call this realist? This is so unrealistic. So many
Right.
books I read that are hailed as realism, I think this is completely unrealistic.
Mm.
Well, I was alive in New York in 1970, whatever, and I'm reading this realist book, and it was nothing like this.
Yeah.
Or
And of course, realism as a,
that's
sorry.
getting it wrong. The other issue with realism is just that I feel like we all do see things differently. So I have a question, I'm always questioning. You try to find the place where we can all connect,
Mhm.
but I don't know that I believe there's a platonic real.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think the problem with realism as a genre, not as something that putatively is real, but as like a genre, like a form of writing, which is like most of the writing that's put out in trade publication, most fiction belongs to this genre. It has certain presumptions about the way the world works that are embedded in it that I think are sort of like fundamentally false. Like the stability of the self is one. Like,
That would be a good one to start with. I would
yeah,
agree with that one. There are a lot of assumptions built into realistic fiction, a lot of
sure.
assumptions that I find don't sync up with the way I see the world. So for me, you could even say it's not realistic.
Yes,
But
exactly.
it doesn't
And
even count as realism because I so don't see the world that way. I don't make those assumptions.
right.
And there are many, many realist novels that I admire. I think they are incredibly well constructed and
Hmm.
riveting sometimes, but I don't really find them realistic.
I mean, I really love that you don't share there's a real sort of doctrinaire kind of like,
It hasn't won me a lot of friends, by the way.
no, yeah, but who cares? Friends, who cares?
You're my friend. I'll take that. It hasn't won me a lot of friends, but I don't have this interest in these distinctions.
How can't you, like, why wouldn't you let that story find its own form rather than sort of shoehorning yourself over and over again into something that's sort of prepackaged for you in some ways? And I mean, that is something I admire about your books, is that they all feel very sui generis, right?
Yes, unfortunately, yes.
But no, it's great. And I mean, that makes for a heavy lift, I think.
It's not,
It's not great from a branding perspective, and I agree.
Marketing perspective, it's tough,
Right.
but they are sui generis because I do start with ideas and stories, and then I try to find the form. And as I say, I don't really, realism doesn't resonate with me as an idea that much, unless one is writing nonfiction, in which I think you have a responsibility to facts. And
Although I will say, as somebody who works in journalism now, I would make the distinction between journalism and nonfiction, mainly because the nonfiction that I've read is, trade nonfiction, is narrative nonfiction. And the qualifier narrative is really important because, like, take any set of veridically verifiable facts and everybody can make a totally different story out of them.
Absolutely. So narrative nonfiction is a different, but then
Yes.
there's journalism, which, and then there's just the fact that, as we were saying, we're all different. We see things differently. We might view the facts differently and write them down in ways that appear different. But of course, there are things. It's not like I doubt the reality of the world or the reality of, you're right here, I'm here. But
on the other side of this screen somewhere.
I think you're there. but it's just not my answer to you, if you did pose a question about realism, is don't worry about it.
I think I probably won't going forward. And honestly, like, one of my all-time favorite writers is Italo Calvino, and every single book he wrote was in a completely different form. And some hit, some missed, but there's a shit ton of them. And it was a writing life. And as a whole, it was a massive success. And I sort of think, like, if you have the courage of your convictions, then I would say, for those like you and me, then, you know, you really have nothing to lose. Hi,
I
John.
hope so. I feel like I can't live or write any other way. Hey, John.
We do have some questions from the audience. If I want to leave some time for those, although I am compelled to just listen to both of you talk for another hour or more. And thank you. So the first question, though, dovetails with a lot of conversation so far. Do you, for Peter, Jared writes, do you let the style of prose dictate itself, or do you go into a book with a specific voice or style in mind? For example, and this was a question was submitted before you brought it up, Same feels to me almost Nabokovian in its obtruse Byzantine style. The delivery, to me, conveys a minimalism and economy of style that feels consciously different from Same. Did you go into each project with these voices in mind, or did the literary voices simply arrive unconsciously through the act of writing?
Great question. In both cases, the voice came at the same time as the idea for the material. So Same is a book, let's see, I think from 2018. I can't remember. It seems like years ago. And the idea was to sort of contend with what I saw as the increasing amount of simulacra in our daily lives. Little did I know that we would be on Zoom screens. And yet here we are. And the idea was to kind of make the world feel as strange as it felt to me, this modern world. So it was written in a kind of unstyle, with uncharacters, and it, like any first novel, I guess, I mean, maybe not for people more talented than me, but for me anyway, it was a first novel, so it felt like I had to shoehorn in a lot of ideas. Every time out the gate now, I feel like I have to say less, which is really nice. And so for this book, like, I knew I wanted to talk about somebody coming into culture and coming into language. So the idea of doing that Joycean thing where you start out simple and end up complex just came right along with the idea at the same moment. So the book that I'm working on now, which is called Weepers, which is about people who are paid to cry at funerals, is told it's the most voicey thing I've ever written. I'm about 3/4 of the way done right now. And it's told with a kind of twangy, kind of McMurtry style. It's a funny book. And that form, that style, that register didn't come to me until I realized that the book had to be set in a dry place, and it's set in a kind of desert community in the US, somewhere in the Southwest. And then the voice just came. But I would imagine that probably for every novelist, it's different every time out. That's sort of what we were saying, Jane, right?
Yeah.
Is that your experience?
I would add that I do see the Joycean movement in this book, but I also see and felt it where he starts to become more fluent and is riding and kind of, you know, in his, I mean, not to diminish it, but the sort of E.T. biker, like he's going to fly off into the sky.
Taking off.
No, it's fabulous. It's beautiful. It's propulsive. I also felt a kind of certain sections, and I know you had been engaged not that long ago with Gravity's Rainbow, and I felt certain sections had a Pynchon-esque movement, not that wasn't Joycean, that really felt like certain sections in Pynchon that just go and glide and go in a gorgeous linguistic.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, Pynchon was the first writer I ever read who did that. Even before I had read Joyce, I read Pynchon, and that idea.
That's who I would say, although there is an arc of, you know, going from the simple to the more long.
It's a funny thing I kind of noticed that was really in some ways counterintuitive, but the more language you have and the less punctuation you have, the slower the book is, which is to read, like the actual experience of reading it, which I guess makes a lot of sense in retrospect. But in a way, the book, rather than like diegetically, it's supposed to take off, but actually stylistically, it becomes slower and more intricate in some ways. That was an interesting thing to find out. And just as a weird little side note, and why parables are problems, when I first submitted this book to a particular prestigious publisher, their response was, "We love it, but only if it's in the voice of the end of the book." And then I had another prestigious publisher saying, "We love it, but only if it's in the form of the beginning of the book." And I was like, but that's not the project. and I guess, chacun son goût, as they say in Frogland. But I just, it is interesting to me that each of us, not just as a writer like you and me, Jane, I mean, more you than me, but still, there is, like, as readers, we have commitments to style. Like, there are things that turn us off and there are things that turn us on. And nobody is going to change that reader's mind on those things.
No. Well, I'm so glad you found the publisher, quite prestigious, by the way, who accepted the project as is.
I do love my publisher. So many props to Farrar Straus.
It's exactly the right project for this book. I mean, it's exactly the right stylistic movement. It's exactly what it should be. I take books as they come. I don't expect them to be something other, but this seems so right. So
I'm so happy, Jane. That makes me very happy to hear you say that. And speaking of writerly anxieties, like, other writers reading your books is fucking terrifying. But anyway, other questions?
Well, related to what you were talking about, and a viewer writes, how do you focus yourself toward the identity of a book through your editing or rewriting process before your book gets to your agent and editor? This is from someone who is currently working on their own work as well, and writes that their own unedited prose seems sometimes like an unformed goo of possibilities that need shape, limitations, and direction.
Yeah, I think we all know that feeling. I mean, the beginning of every book is like a kind of Sartrean nausea of too many possibilities, not enough belief in your own power to sort of sculpt something out of them. That's universal, right, Jane?
I think so.
I don't know. Wait, I just forgot. You have this crazy, prodigious ability to form a book in your mind and then just transcribe it, right?
Well, I had to find that when I had small children. I just found myself writing it kind of in my head.
Right.
But I do outline or note take a lot before I actually, and I write some sentences or some passages, but I take a long time to figure out what the voice is going to be. Of course, in the end, it just sort of is what it is. But to answer this person's question, goo is the ideal word. It always feels like a big, mushy slime.
It's gross.
It's gross, and you feel like, yuck, I don't want to deal with this. How will I ever make it into something? So you are on the right track.
Yeah. I will just add to that, like, remember to breathe and remember that the discomfort is part of it. Like, the discomfort is it. Like,
it's not linear and it's not comfortable.
You have to be comfortable with the discomfort, It's like learning how to run. It's going to really, really suck. And even if you're good at, even after you're good at it, it's still going to suck. The pain becomes part of it. And if you can't live with that pain, then that's problematic because, man, it's going to be inchoate at the beginning always. But I don't know, like, in this new project that I'm working on right now, there is a turn. There is a moment where something resolves into clarity and there's no feeling more joyous.
Yes.
That's
what makes you keep coming back.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, after each book, you would never do it again.
Yeah, it's true. It's a wonderful moment.
But there is I would agree, a joyous kind of feeling of total freedom and understanding of, I get what I caused this problem for myself. I created this problem for myself. And finally now I see at least a bit of how to solve it. And that's a fantastic feeling.
And often that solution has I don't know how to word this exactly, but part of finding the solution is when you're able to get out of your own way. And at the moment at which you realize that the impediment was you all along, which is actually something I find in my daily life a lot, but specifically in fiction writing. I hope that answered that question. Stay the course.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Never, never, never give up.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Peter, in the look of the book, you mentioned the phenomena of literary fiction authors dipping into genre styles to color the literary fiction experience. Are either of you, Peter and Jane, deeply inspired by any particular genre writing, along with more literary inspirations?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to start, Jane?
Well, my first literary love after, children's books was I dove right into Agatha Christie. So the first books I wrote when I was a little girl were all Agatha Christie mysteries with, people bursting through the French doors, and I didn't know what French doors were, and there were dead bodies, and like the genre of mystery captivated me from a very young age. So, I think a lot of good fiction now, especially, seems to have a mystery built into it, but at the time, it was very, very much relegated to mystery in those years. And so I would say more than anything, mystery was the genre that inspired me. And ghost stories. When I was a little girl, I loved ghost stories. So ghost stories and mysteries, as I don't think of them as genre. And I think a lot of great writers have written both. And there is an essential component of a lot of great books, but straight mystery, straight ghost story, I love.
Yeah, ditto. My mother had all the Agatha Christie paperbacks when I was a kid. I loved those books. Man, I would just add first of all, genre is tricky, right? Because like I was saying before, like most trade middlebrow literary fiction is genre, right? And to the extent to which something comes at you with a kind of boilerplate mentality, right? And it's sort of participating in a series of rules and doesn't really kind of extend beyond those rules, it's genre. And that applies to literary fiction the same way it does to science fiction, speculative fiction.
In my opinion, literary fiction is a genre.
Sure. And it's as predictable. I think about some of the novels that I've read over the last 20 years, and it's like, okay, here's the family, here's the dysfunction in the family, here's the luminous description of the one moment where something is closely observed. Here is there is a rhythm and a periodicity and a kind of like typology to these books. But I'm just going to add like speculative fiction, science fiction, cli-fi, everything that falls under the sort of rubric of speculative fiction I adore. And I wish I had it in me to write something like that, because I wicked love reading those books. But also, horror, espionage. I just finished reading for the third time the John le Carré Carla trilogy, which I just can't seem to get enough of. And boy, that man could write a sentence.
He's amazing. I would agree with with certain kinds of sci-fi and horror. I loved all the Twilight Zone books when I was a kid. Read every single Twilight Zone.
The truth is, most of my discretionary reading is either like super pretentious and annoying, or it's like, there's certain kinds of series like fantasy series and horror series and speculative fiction series and writers that I just like, it's my meat and potatoes. Like that's what I read. Like here's the most annoying thing I'm going to say tonight, but there's a line in Proust towards the end where this kind of very effete character, Charlus, he has this line where he says, I detest the intermediate style. And there's something in that which I just like resonated with me. I was like, the thing I hate is that tranche, like that big piece of fat right in the middle, like whether it's like where people are just not trying hard enough. But yeah, whatever it is, I'm totally agnostic on genre.
Me too. Agnostic is the word. Genre doesn't mean, in the same way, realism, whatever, like agnostic about genre. If it's a good book.
Yeah.
If it's a good book, I love it. And they come in all forms, all shapes and sensibilities. If I
Ditto.
I connect.
Ditto.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Of course, you can purchase Jane and Peter's books from Literati Bookstore, literatibookstore.com, and as well in the links in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. Jane and Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight on At Home with Literati. It's truly a pleasure to welcome you both. And I hope I can have you both in the store sometime in the future on the other side of all this. But until then, thank you for such a lovely conversation. And we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well as well. But until we can have you back in the store, we'll see you at the next virtual event. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, John.
Good night, all.